My name's John Sloboda. I'm a music psychologist, and I've written quite a lot on the process of engaging with music, particularly from the perspective of the listener and the performer. But only once in my life did I write anything about composition, and that was about 40 years ago. And one of the reasons why I've written so little on composition is because composers in general seem very unwilling to let outsiders into their process. So this is a great privilege and allows me to ask of a living composer some of the burning questions I have. And it's Peter Fender who has graciously agreed to satisfy my curiosity. So hello, Peter.
It's a pleasure, John. Thank you. No, I'm very interested in the process of writing music because it's something I do. And if this can help me in any way understand a little bit better what I'm engaged in, I'd be delighted.
Thank you, Peter. Well, shall we dive straight in? Because I've got quite a long list of questions. And my first one is, have you written this piece with particular performers in mind?
Yes and no. Terrible start to an answer, that, isn't it? Yes, in the sense that I am booking the orchestra for the performance of this piece. So this is not a piece I'm writing in isolation just as a sort of an exercise for myself or something like that. I have a particular performance in mind in a few months' time. So I will be actually gathering together the orchestra for that, and I will know a lot of the players. So in that sense, I have an awareness of the sort of people who are going to be playing it, their capabilities. There will be quite a mixture between professionals, amateurs, music students. So I've got that awareness in the back of my mind as something which, to some extent, delimits a little of what I do. So I'm not, for example, writing unbelievably high notes for the oboe. A lot of oboists don't like that anyway, or unbelievably low notes for that matter. So yeah, there are a few constraints in my mind like that. And I always think that's a really, really nice thing for a composer. To have some things like an idea of who the people are playing it, to give you some limits, is actually a very comforting thing.
So you said yes and no. So what's the no?
was that the yes?
Yes. Are you envisaging that this piece will have a life beyond the performance in a few months' time, and that, in a sense, it's part of your legacy as a composer?
I hope so. Yes, I do hope so. The problem for a composer is always, of course, the second performance of their piece. First performances come round okay, usually, because the composer makes it happen in some way, but a second performance can be a little bit more tricky. I suppose the no was more in the sense of I have a general idea about who's going to play this, but it's not as if I'm writing this, let's say, for the London Sinfonietta. If I knew them well, I would literally know the horn player, the oboe player, whoever was going to play it. I don't have that level of knowledge.
Understood. You've already mentioned, okay, you're not going to write too many high oboe notes or too many low oboe notes, but in a more general way, has the knowledge of who will be performing this piece and when and where it will be performed determine any features of your compositional process or your decisions?
Not largely, no, not to a large extent. I am aware, actually, that's a good point about the performance venue. That has been in my mind a little bit. It's a reasonably large acoustic. It's got a good bloom on the sound, let's say. So it's not dry. It's not a theatre type sound at all. So that has been in my mind as to not writing stuff that's going to get muddy within the reverb, within the sound of the building. But not to a large extent, no. I think it's just a small thing round the edges. By the way, another thing that's been in my mind is the number of rehearsals we have for this, which is not a large number. So that means if I write some things which are really, really difficult, it's going to cause issues. That's also been in my head.
That's exactly the kind of thing I was looking for. I am an amateur composer myself, and I've written pieces. one in particular I'm thinking of, which was written with a particular church in mind, with a particular resonance, and the particular organ in that church, which
Yeah.
had particular stops on it, which determine my composition of choices.
Yeah.
And I discovered that when that piece has been performed in other churches, in other acoustics, with other organs, it just doesn't work.
That's a very, very good point. I was thinking a little while ago about King's College, Cambridge. Similar but sort of related point. I used to play in orchestras in King's College, Cambridge quite regularly. And that choir in that building, in front of that choir screen, sounds quite extraordinary. Put them in a different building, they still sound great, but they sound very different. So the building makes a lot of difference. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe this could have a life beyond December. Let's not put into it anything odd, not have any strange percussion instruments which are not a sort of standard part of the orchestra, strange instruments in general. I was sent a score recently by a very young composer, teenager. He sent me a score of a piece he'd written, which looked really interesting, but he'd written it for a slightly unusual combination of instruments. And my reply to him was, I really like what you're doing, but because you've written it for this strange combination, you're going to find it hard to get it played. So one has to be pragmatic in that sense.
That moves me on a little bit to asking about what some people call compositional language. If someone was to listen to your piece and was musically knowledgeable, would they be able to say, oh, that's a bit like this composer, or I can hear strands of that composer in the writing?
Yes, I'm sure they would. I played an early draft of the first movement to my wife, and she said, oh, that's quite like Shostakovich, isn't it? And I wasn't sure whether to be flattered or not. I think in general I was flattered. Some of that is conscious and some of it's not conscious. So I have had, and I have in fact, a pile on the floor behind me. I have had a number of scores out that I've been looking at. Things by people like Mahler, Shostakovich, Benjamin Britten, Steve Reich, all sorts of composers, which I, just had a little look through for some reason or other. Something I've been thinking of has reminded me of some piece. And some of that has without doubt filtered through into what I've done. So to be specific, I think there are probably little bits of Shostakovich, Britten, Steve Reich. I mentioned those three. Possibly even a little bit of Mahler at one point. There's all sorts of stuff. Let me answer your question in a different way. I think in general, I'm a fairly eclectic person, but not just in music, in all sorts of walks of life. And I think that's how my music comes out. So you'll hear in one of the movements, I've written a 14-bar blues, which is perhaps a little unusual for a symphony, but that's the sort of genre of music I rather like, and it felt like it needed to get in there. So it's quite changeable. Somebody is not going to come away saying, oh, that all sounded like Shostakovich. But there may be sections they could identify something like that.
Thank you. And we know that in audiences for music that's being played today, a lot of audiences, particularly those who are not particularly musically trained, will make a very clear distinction in the things that they hear on the concert platform. They'll talk about things that have got tunes and the things that haven't got tunes.
Yeah.
Does your composition have tunes?
It has some tunes, yeah. There are sections without tunes which are, if you like, they're layers of sound. So, in fact, that little section I just mentioned, the blues section, doesn't really have a tune to it. It's got a sort of blues feel, and the instruments are used in more of a rhythmic way. So there's nothing out of that I think you would go humming in a tuneful manner, although you might go away with a little bit of a feel of the rhythm of the beats of the section. But there are some tunes, yes. I like tunes. I just think they're rather nice things. A composer I'm rather fond of called George Lloyd, an English composer who lived pretty much the entirety of the 20th century, was asked about this by an interviewer once, why he wrote tunes, because lots of other people gave up writing tunes many years before. And he said, well, I like them. They sing. People like to sing. And that's how I feel as well, that there's something innate in us about tunefulness, and the singing of tunes is such an important part of our culture, actually, deep down. It's an important thing. So whilst, like George Lloyd actually went on to say, I could write you 12-tone music. For me, it doesn't sing. Okay, let me just go back one step. I think from when I started composing in earnest, maybe 15 years ago or so, I set myself a task that I would try and write music which was accessible, that people could listen to once only and could get something out of. That it wasn't that they were thinking, oh, I've got to hear that 20 more times before I can make sense of it. I didn't want that. So I wanted sort of an immediacy about the music. But I didn't want it to sound trite. I wanted it to feel that there was a level of depth, which if somebody wanted to listen to it 20 times, they could actually do that happily and still get more out of it. For the performer of the music, I wanted it to have the same sort of feel, so that it wasn't terribly easy to play, but it wasn't terribly, terribly difficult. So I'm looking for a middle ground, I think, all round.
So that's a really interesting area that you've moved into, Peter, and one which wasn't on my question list, but actually it's a fascinating one, which is, who are you writing for? And what you've just raised there is that in many ways you are writing for the performer, and the performer has to have a satisfying experience of your piece.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of my life I've sat in orchestras as a violinist and played other people's music. So I've got that experience. And I think I'm always thinking that if I'm writing something, how does this feel to the performer?
That's really good to hear. And because, of course, your performers are in some ways your most knowledgeable, but also your most critical listeners. And if they don't resonate to your piece, they won't give a good performance of it.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. I think it's a factor that isn't always present in a composer's mind, for right or wrong. But another thing I think about in this vein is, from the get-go, at the first rehearsal for this symphony, if the performers feel engaged and are enjoying the process, they will invite their family and friends to the performance, which is a very important practical matter in the overall scheme of what one is doing. Finances matter.
Thank you. I'd like to dig now, if you don't mind, a little bit deeper into what you might call the intimate process of doing this work. And first of all, some just framing. You may have said this before, but you haven't said it in my presence. When did you start this compositional work? When must it be finished? And roughly, how are you scheduling your work between start and finish?
Okay, so I started it in July. I have a deadline of the beginning of December when there is the concert. However, the deadline is really before that, because I have to have the music ready, have to have the parts ready so I can get them out to people, they can see them in advance. So really, my deadline at the moment is the end of October. Part of the reason for that is that I'm basically out of action doing other stuff for 2 weeks at the beginning of November. So if I had it ready the end of October, that would be ideal. The scheduling of the process, I've not written anything down about that. I've had a sort of an idea of how I want it to go, of how quickly I want to get through the material. Let me be a bit more specific. I write in a draft form to start with. I think most composers will do that, especially when they're writing for a large group like an orchestra. And my aim is to get that draft finished by the end of September, by the end of this month. And then I've got a month in which to go back over it, polish it up, get the instrumentation right, all sorts of other bits and bobs right about it.
Let's just stop at that point, because you said something about a draft, and I'm really curious as to what a draft looks like, which is different to the finished product. Are you saying, for example, that the draft does not have instrumentation on it?
No, it does have instrumentation on it, but there are certainly, I was going to say parts, large parts, possibly the majority of it, where I'm not absolutely fixed as to the way I've put it on the paper or on the screen, in my case, is how it will finish up. So there might be a section where I've scored it for, let's say, strings and clarinet, but actually I know in my head that might not be the finished product. I might want to change the clarinet to an oboe. I might want to add in the flutes. So there are all sorts of bits like that. I don't do it in what was a very traditional way to do it, of writing a short score of, say, 4 staves. And on it, you've got little notes saying horn, woodwind, stuff like that, so that when the composer comes back, they know what they're up to. I tend to have thought out some of that as I go, with the knowledge that actually that could well change.
Interesting. Now, in terms of your work style, do you do a little bit each day, or are there some days where you just shut the door on everybody else and you just give a whole day to it? How do you work best in that respect?
I can't do more than, I would say, 3 or 4 hours at a stretch. If I started in the morning, after lunch, I would just be saturated. I would be, I wouldn't be producing anything useful at all. So, a morning, a afternoon, an afternoon even, an evening would be absolutely fine. Less than about an hour, I don't feel is really useful at all. Although it depends what I'm trying to do. At the moment I'm composing, I'm not going back on what I've written and altering, correcting, doing that sort of instrumentation thing I was talking about. I read a composer, and I've unfortunately forgotten his name. It was a he. And one of the things he said was, decide at any moment what you are doing. Are you composing or are you correcting? That was his way of putting it. I understand what he means. If I'm composing, I need a good chunk of time.
How much of the composition is pretty much fixed now, in the sense that the first movement's done and dusted, and how much is still fluid, or is it all still in some sense fluid? Is there some of it that you've not even started yet?
I've pretty much got 3 movements in some sort of bag and have just made a tinsy start on the last movement. But it feels as if the material is fairly fixed. I don't see there being many sort of structural changes, for example, in those 3 movements. The structural changes are, for me, part of the sort of first part of the process.
How long did it take you after starting before you got to that kind of certainty about what the whole thing was going to kind of look like?
Right. I think I had ideas about it right from the very start. In fact, before I'd really written anything, I had some ideas about what I thought each movement would feel like, certainly in a mood sense, perhaps not quite a structural sense. That has modified as I've gone on. So I remember having a chat about this earlier on, when I was saying, the second movement I feel is going to be quite lyrical, tuneful, a little bit more downbeat from the first movement. It's partially true, but actually it's not really turned out quite like that. It's sort of modified along the way. For me, I think it's necessary to have an idea, to have some sort of conception about what I'm hoping to produce. And then if during that process it actually turns into something else, I don't mind that. That's fine. That's part of the process for me.
I'm trying to think of an analogy, something like designing and building a house. You have to have your plan of how many rooms it's going to be and how the rooms will relate to each other quite early on.
True.
And it's very difficult to change that. But you can suddenly decide, actually, there should be a door there, and I hadn't thought that originally. Or, there can be modifications within that general plan quite late in the day.
Yes, I suppose where I've got to now, certainly there is a plan which is reasonably fixed for those 3 movements. Yes. And I suppose I'm in the stage where with those movements, if I wanted to shift the door around, etc., then yes, I can still, but I'm not going to try and actually alter the configuration of the rooms anymore. They feel now fairly set. And actually, I suppose the analogy breaks down that it's as I'm building that I discover how the rooms do fit together. I wrote a bit which I thought was going to go into the third movement. It just didn't fit, it just sounded wrong. So I moved it out. And then I thought, actually, that's an ideal beginning to the last movement. So it was, the configuration I thought was one thing, but it turned out, in my mind, to be better that it was another.
And that's very interesting because it shows actually that the generative process is about making things and then kind of having a good look at them and assessing what it is you've made, and then finding new things out about them, having made them.
Somebody like Mahler, who did that more than once, wrote a movement which he thought was going to be in a certain symphony, but it turned out to be the wrong thing. The third symphony, he wrote a movement which actually then went into the fourth symphony. And for me, composing is sort of a linear process, so I do tend to work through it from beginning, but it's not 100% like that. I know there are people who do plan on a, really in quite a stringent way how they're going to make things happen. I don't feel I can do that.
So we've been talking really about what we might call the architecture of composition, the grand sweep of the conception of what it is you're doing and how bits might fit. So I want to kind of probe in a little bit. There you are at the beginning of a movement, a blank score in front of you. How does it get filled with notes?
I think before anything is written, there's all sorts of stuff going on in one's head. I remember talking to a composer friend of mine once who has been a composer all his, quite a long life. I said to him, when do you compose? And really asking the same question you asked me a minute ago, John. Do you have particular moments? Do you shut the door all day, etc., etc.? And he said, I compose constantly. I'm composing right now. And I thought, oh, what an interesting answer. I should have probed him a little bit on it. But it feels a little bit like that there's a lot of the time when I'm aware of it and actually when I'm not, which is probably more important in a sense, things are going on. So there's something there to access already. It's not as if I've sort of got nothing and then I've got to create something out of nothing.
So what I'm getting the sense of is bubbling away in your mind, consciousness, sometimes semi-consciousness all the time, are musical ideas, because you're a musician and you think music in the same way as many of us think speech. We've always got speech running in our minds, but you have some kind of music running in your mind, which you can just tap when you have a mind to putting some of it on paper.
Yeah, something like that. And it's not quite in the sense of it's all there. All I've got to do is find the right sort of state and then it'll pour out. But yes, I think, I'm in my 60s. I've heard a lot of music. I've played a lot of music in the years I've been playing. And so there's a lot of stuff, a lot of memories, a lot of stuff all milling around in my memory. I think there's some, combinations of that. You're the person who can answer this better than I can, but combinations of that flow together and ideas come as to how something might be, yes, sometimes consciously, but I think often without conscious thought.
You've talked about what's going on in your mind, and you've talked about where it lands up, which is on a piece of software, a musical score. But is there something intermediate? Do you try out bits of it on the keyboard, for example?
Yes, I do. There's a keyboard just sitting next to the camera here. I find improvising on the piano quite useful sometimes. Just I would call it noodling, just trying to find things on the piano. So I may have, for example, the very beginning of the symphony, I had this idea that it was going to be fairly dark in mood. So with that general thought in my head, I can go to the piano and just sort of experiment with some dark sounds and see what might come out. I think I do a mixture. Some of the time I will use the piano. Some of the time I won't. Some of the time I'll just think it and fiddle with the software and change a note and think, oh yeah, that sounds right, or that sounds wrong.
I've got a final question, and then I think we should probably finish for today, which is, do you ever experience you're out and about, maybe standing at a bus stop waiting for a bus, and suddenly something comes to your mind and you think, I really need to get this down and take this home with me. Does that ever happen, and how do you do it?
It doesn't really happen in the sense of, we have stories of Beethoven, for example, wandering in the countryside with a notebook in his pocket and going, oh, yes, getting the notebook out and writing down the sound of a bird or whatever had come to his mind. I don't do that. I think the best way I can answer that question is, you know how it is when you're trying to remember a fact. Somebody has asked you a question, perhaps, and you think, oh, the answer is on the tip of my tongue, but I can't get it out. You know the answer to something, but it just won't come. And the more you think about it, the less you can remember it. And then half an hour later, when you're talking about something completely different, or in the middle of the night, up comes the response, the answer to the question, which you couldn't find earlier. I find composing to be a bit like that, particularly when there are issues, blockages, things that just aren't working. I was literally walking down the road one day when I suddenly thought how I could structure one of the movements better. So I'd been struggling with what order things should go in, and I couldn't make it work. And then I was literally just walking down the road, probably to the bus stop, and oh, why don't you actually omit that section and then put, and I thought, oh, why didn't I think of that before? And it was at a moment I was not consciously thinking about that at all. When it's issues in the sense of problems, from my point of view, a problem of not seeing how things work, that is more often than not the way that they get solved. If I wrestle with them and struggle, I get more and more stuck, almost get more and more entangled in whatever notes I'm dealing with. But my mind needs to just sort of distance itself, my conscious mind, and then something else is going on inside. I allow it the time and the space to do that, and then it provides me with an answer.
Thank you, Peter. It's been wonderful talking to you. I think we'll leave it there for today.
Thanks, John.
Bye-bye.